I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Gives me great pleasure to introduce you, actually, Piers. He teaches English freelance in London, and having probably previously taught in Japan and France, he taught English pronunciation at the University of Paris 3. He has a PhD on how pronunciation is learned by children and adults from the Department of Phonetics at University College London. And Piers was also one of the co-organizers with IATEFL Pronunciation SIG for the conference today. So I'd like you to put your hands together and give an enormous welcome to Piers Messum. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the best spelling I've ever had. Thank you, Lila. I came across a phrase last year. Alan Tonkin at the IATEFL conference said that pronunciation is a gateway skill. And what he then presented was evidence which showed that in international tests like IELTS and TOEFL, if your pronunciation wasn't good, the examiners couldn't discover that your grammar was good or vocabulary or other expression was good. The pronunciation was the key to getting a good mark in that score. And a few years ago, I was teaching in the East London, in Dagenham, and I was teaching immigrants to this country who needed to get a job. And it was a gateway skill for them as well, because when they had their first telephone interviews, in jobs in Britain, you often have a first interview by telephone, and then you're asked to go and actually meet the employer. In the first interview in telephone, unless the pronunciation was good, the candidate didn't actually get through to the second interview. And our students are always telling us, we want to be able to pronounce better. So from all possible directions, pronunciation, we know, is a very important skill. But unfortunately, when teachers are taught in initial training courses, and many textbooks take this line as well, the only methodology which is suggested for people to use is listen and repeat. The idea is that the teacher presents the model either in his or her own voice or some sort of recorded materials, the class echoes it back, and somehow magic is supposed to happen and pronunciation is supposed to improve, and we know that it doesn't work like that. Students go out of the classes and their pronunciation is exactly the same as before the class started. However, there is some good news, and the good news is that there is another way of teaching pronunciation, and it's called the articulatory approach. A number of people do it, you can find out about it, but you have to work a little bit harder, because as a teacher, you need to find out what people do to make the articulatory approach work. You need to find out what people do as native speakers to pronounce their own language. And then, of course, you have to find ways to teach that in your classes. But we expect when we teach grammar, we expect to do a little bit of work ourselves to find out how the grammar of the language works. In the same way, we need to find out how the pronunciation of, in this case, English works, and then we can pass this on to our students in our classes. Now, if you were in here before the break, you'll have seen my colleague Roslyn Young. I work with Roslyn. You'll have seen my colleague Roslyn Young showing you how to teach sounds while avoiding listen and repeat. And the key thing is for the teacher to remain silent and for the students to do all the work investigating the mouth gymnastics involved in producing new sounds. But what we found is that for English, I should actually just put up her chart. What she was doing was she was using a colored chart like this for teaching French. What we found, though, is that for English, there comes a point when it's right to teach sounds, and you can use a color chart or you can use a phonemic chart for English in the same way as she did for French. But it's worth doing more preparation before doing that. There's an underlying system, or in fact systems to English, which is worth getting in place. And once you've done that preparatory work, the sounds then fall in very naturally and you get a more successful result. So this presentation is about 4 things that Roslyn and I do before we start teaching sounds when we're teaching pronunciation. I should say the articulatory approach, as Roslyn mentioned before, treats pronunciation as a motor skill. We know it is a motor skill. It's something you have to do with yourself to produce a certain to produce a certain output. But when you do with listen and repeat, we're not teaching it as if it was a motor skill. We're going to teach pronunciation as if it was any other physical activity, a sport or anything else. And for that, we need to understand how it works, what people do in order to get good pronunciation. So if you're teaching a motor skill, one thing we know about learning motor skills is the person has to be present to what they're doing. There's no point in you being present to something else while you're trying to learn something like pronunciation. And similarly, once you are present to what you're doing, you have to develop sensitivity to the effect of a tiny movement of a tongue. What is the effect of a tiny movement of a tongue in terms of what it feels like, what it sounds like, etc. So these 2 things need to be worked on, and they're going to need to be worked on throughout our course. This is not something we just do at the beginning, but we somehow have to launch students into the idea that this is going to be important for them to actually become present to what they're doing with themselves and more sensitive to it. And so the way we start classes off is we start with an exercise that Rosalind did in a little way with you in French beforehand, but we do in a more extended way in English, because it's more important in English that students are very familiar with the inside of their mouths. Because for English, they're going to have to change more. From students from most languages, they're going to have to change more about the way they speak than going, say, from French to Italian. English is quite a big step in terms of the way we use our mouths compared to moving from some languages to some other languages. So what we tend to do is start off with an exercise something like this. This is a classic cutaway of a human head. And you can see that you've got the jaw and you've got the nasal cavity up here. What we've done, though, is we've rubbed out the profile of the roof of the mouth, and we've erased the tongue. And what we ask our students to do, we give them a copy of this drawing, and I'm going to ask you to do it mentally because you haven't obviously got copies in front of you. But what we ask students to do is to explore the inside of their mouths with their tongues and fill in this diagram. Fill in from where the roof of the mouth starts to where it finishes, and fill in what the shape of their tongue is down here. And the only tool they have available to do that is their tongue. They can't look inside their mouths, so they have to start exploring and being very present to what's inside their mouths, and also develop increasing sensitivity to get the fine details right. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds. If you've got a piece of paper, you might just want to use the tip of your tongue to explore, to start with, the roof of your mouth, and see if you can draw in what's the shape of the roof of your mouth. If you start from the top of the front teeth, and you go all the way back here, what do you discover the profile of the roof of your mouth looks like? Not looks like, feels like, of course, because it's your tongue which is investigating this. And of course, some students will make a very good job of this. What we want to do is for them to be increasingly sensitive. So while they're doing this exercise, if a student does it very quickly and is very good at mapping this out, we can ask additional questions like, what's the texture of the roof of your mouth? So as you run your tongue from front to back, is the texture which you're encountering always the same? And of course, what people find, and what you might investigate for yourself right now, is that while it's soft at the back and at the top, and then it goes hard again, as it comes down again, as we're coming, I mean, I'm sure you're aware, I'll move this on, because I'm sure you are all aware of what the inside of your mouth looks like. But you can ask students to focus on this area here and feel the texture here. And if you take the tip of your tongue now and focus on that area there, you might find that it's got quite a curious texture. So this is the kind of work we do with our students. For the first 2 or 3 minutes, we also ask them to draw the shape of their tongue so they have some sense of what's going on there. And we get 2 things out of doing this. One is that we are going to have to name things like the tip of the tongue. They are going to have to know about the position of their alveolar ridge for speaking English if we're going to be giving them articulatory instructions on how to speak English. But most of all, what they're developing is the idea that being present to their articulators and becoming more and more sensitive to them is going to be something which is useful and which they're going to use throughout the course. So that's the first thing. That's the way we start off a course. Before we ever get going on to sounds. The next thing we do is we work on what is the single underlying driver, the single most important underlying driver of English pronunciation, which is stress. This is the thing which makes English distinctive from almost all the other languages of the world, the way that we make syllables prominent in English. Now, I should just say that the word stress gets used in 2 distinct ways when we're talking about English pronunciation. The so-called lexical stress, which is the issue about which syllable would receive a stress when the word is spoken. We're not talking about that. We're talking now about sentence stress, which is in a string of syllables, some syllables are more prominent than others. How is it that a syllable appears to be more prominent in English? Now, again, we can look at this from 2 perspectives. One is to say, what does it sound like? And if you answer that question, you get questions. If you ask that question, you get answers like it's louder, it's longer, there may be a pitch change on it, it may have a clearer vowel quality. All these things make the vowel in a syllable more prominent. But if you take that approach, that's not exactly a teachable thing to do. It's very difficult to say to students, or if you do say to students, make it louder, they might do the exercise in the class, but when they walk out of the class, they haven't really got very much to hang on to. And our experience is that teaching it just saying, make it louder or longer, is not going to be the thing which students can take away and practice on their own, which again, as Rosalind pointed out, is a key thing about pronunciation. The work we do in the class is not going to be what turns students into good speakers of English. It's going to be the work that they do outside of the class on their own. So what we ask instead, taking an articulatory approach, is what do people do with themselves to create stress? Now, within English language teaching, we're kind of halfway there already, in the sense that we have recognized that we don't just play recordings of stress and just expect people to imitate them. We do exercises like getting people to clap. We might, when we write stressed syllables up or stressed words up, we put them in capital letters. We want to give indications to people that there's something different about a stressed syllable. But of course, a clap isn't the thing which creates a stress in the voice. We're still not getting at the underlying thing that native speakers do, which creates stress. And we should be teaching that directly. So the first question we have to ask is, what is stress? Well, Peter Roach is a phonetician who recently retired from the University of Reading, who's a professor of phonetics there. He pointed out that stressed syllables are produced with greater effort than unstressed syllables. This effort is manifested in the air pressure in the lungs. So it's all about the respiratory system. And then the effect of this, by putting the greater effort into the lungs, the effect is you get things which are louder and longer and have pitch changes and so on and so forth. But the actual driver for this is what you're doing with yourself to pressurize the air in your lungs. And another phonetician, J.C. Catford, who was an English teacher before he was a phonetician and writes beautifully for language teachers. If this book had only been called a practical introduction to English pronunciation, it should and would have sold in millions, but unfortunately he called it phonetics rather than pronunciation. Now I'll read out the whole quote, which ends up with this thing saying stress is initiator power. And incidentally, when he talked about the initiator, he meant the respiratory system, the things which initiates sounds in speech. So Catford said, the fact that stress is associated with pitch change and duration has led to some confusion. Is stress really pitch or duration or energy or what? Is the kind of muddled question that has often been asked. The answer is that from a general phonetic point of view, stress is initiator power. So it's all about the respiratory system. So why aren't we teaching that? Why are we teaching our students to clap? Why are we teaching them to say things louder when what we should be teaching them is gestures with their respiratory system? Because this is what native speakers do. And it's important to know why we're not doing it. And I think part of the reason is what we've got up on this slide here. This is a scale. You can't actually read the writing here, so I've enlarged it on the right-hand side. This is a scale of the pressures that we can create with our respiratory system. So blowing a trumpet is right up here if you want to blow a trumpet loudly. Sniffing up or sucking up through a straw is somewhere down here. And there's a 0 point here where we're making no effort at all with our respiratory systems. And if you look at this part of the diagram enlarged over here, the thing you'll notice is that conversational speech for an adult hardly taxes the respiratory system at all. By the time we get to be adults, we're so expert at speaking that we can do it without making any effort at all. I don't feel that I'm making big stresses with my respiratory system while I'm talking to you now, because I'm so absolutely expert and practiced at it. So because we haven't made ourselves sensitive as teachers to what we're doing, we don't teach this to our students. But like everything else about pronunciation, in order to get it, one has to hyperarticulate to begin with. You know, when you're learning a new sound, you have to make a big effort to put your tongue in the right position, and then when you've got it, it becomes effortless. And similarly, using the respiratory system for stress involves the same thing. We have to get our students to actively do it, being present to their abdominal muscles and the other parts of the system, and then they can integrate this into their speech normally. So, if we're going to be doing this work with our students, it's important that we understand what it is that's going on with our respiratory system producing stress. And these are a couple of pictures of the anatomy. This is the chap on the right. You can see his lungs are up here, his windpipe. The lungs sit on top of the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle, and the lungs sit on top of it. And to inspire, you use the diaphragm, in fact, and you use these other muscles here on the right-hand side. The muscles up here are inspiratory muscles. And there's sometimes a little bit of confusion in people's mind about the role of the diaphragm. So I have got one picture which just shows the diaphragm here. Here we've got a side view, so the person's head would be on the top. This is the front of his chest. This is the back of his chest. And you've got the diaphragm sitting in the middle, adopting this dome-type shape. Now, muscles can only contract. Muscle fibers can only contract. So when the diaphragm is in its dome shape and the fibers contract, it flattens. And when the diaphragm flattens, it creates more space above, air is pulled in, and for that reason, the diaphragm is an inspiratory muscle. We use it to breathe in with. But you can't actually push out with the diaphragm. The way that the diaphragm can regain its dome-shaped position, the only way that can happen is if it's pushed from below. If the abdominal contents push upwards, And it's exactly like having a tube of toothpaste over here on the right-hand side. If you squeeze at the bottom, if you squeeze your belly down here, that pushes the contents up. And in the case of a toothpaste tube, toothpaste comes out of the top. And in the case of a human, what happens is that the diaphragm pushes the lungs, and the lungs push air out of the top here. So the actual expiratory muscles for English, for speaking, are all the ones down here in the abdomen. We've got lots of thick bands of muscle down here which help us with posture, but also enable us to push air out of ourselves. And these are the ones which we need to train when we're training our students to use expiratory action in order to create stresses. And once they can do this, they can get at what is the single most important, the most fundamental distinction, the most important part of English pronunciation, the distinction between stressed syllables on the top, and a stressed syllable might sometimes carry a pitch change, it may not, it will be louder and longer and all these other things, but they get the distinction between stressed syllables and unstressed syllables, which normally have a schwa in them, but occasionally you'll get a word like yellow, which has a stressed syllable to begin with, a second syllable which isn't stressed, but does have a full vowel in it. So as teachers, we need to be aware of what exactly the distinction is between a stressed syllable, and an unstressed syllable. But once we've got that clear, we can then be teaching our students to make that distinction using their abdominal muscles. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that for an articulatory approach to work in any activity, but particularly in pronunciation, students have to become present to what they're doing and become more sensitive to what it involves. So we do need exercises to take students' presence, and our own presence for that matter, to what we're doing with our abdominal muscles. We've all long ago automatized, made automatic, all the gestures involved with speech. What we need to do is to come back to that and make it conscious again. So I'm just going to illustrate this with a few of the sort of exercises one can do, just making extended s and z sounds. And instead of paying attention to what's happening with your mouth, now pay attention to what's happening at the level down here with your abdominal musculature. So for example, if we just take number 3, can you make an extended s and then follow that by making an extended z sound, but keep your attention with what you're doing with your respiratory system. And what's the difference between making a s and a z?
Voiced and unvoiced.
Ah, but now, Lila, you walked in and you missed the point. We're not worrying about the sound up here. We're worrying about the difference down here. What's difference when you make a s sound and a z sound? Yeah. Yep, absolutely. You can feel a difference. There will be differences with the effort you put in, with the volume, the rate of change, because s involves more air coming out, so you'll feel yourself decreasing, this volume decreasing more quickly. Now, we don't have time to do a lot of these exercises, but this is the kind of thing we need to do with ourselves as teachers, and which we can then do with our students to get them used to the idea of being present to what they're doing with their abdominal muscles. I've got another example over here. One quite nice thing is to use snorting. If you channel all the air out of your nose, it becomes very apparent what's going on. So a sniff would be pulling air up in through your nose, and a snort would be pushing air sharply down through your nose. And if you snort, but pay attention to what you do to create that rush of air, you'll discover something about how your abdominal muscles work. Do you want to try that? And can you feel this sharp pull in with your muscles here? This is what you need. If you want to push more air through the system, you want to do this little sharp. Each of the stressed syllables, here we have hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. We've got 6 stressed syllables, and on each one, you should be a little gesture with your respiratory systems in order to create the stresses. Do you want to just try that? Say this sentence, but don't say it in your normal way. Say it with exaggerated gestures with your abdominal muscles. Okay, so we're going to be correct English, but you've just hyper-articulated the speech-breathing aspect of it. And if a student comes to English from a language which doesn't have a system of stress in it, they will have never done anything like this. Whereas English-speaking children have learnt to do this. The process of being an apprentice for English involves, as a child, making very active gestures with the abdominal muscles, which we then automatize and as adults become expert at doing. So we don't need to worry about it anymore. And in fact, our physiology changes, a number of things change. But we need to get this into our students as a physical activity, which they can then take out of the classroom and practice on the bus or in the park, wherever else they're inspired to practice their English. Okay, that was the second thing we work on. The third thing we work on is aspiration, and it doesn't sound like a very important thing, and I'll explain why we work on this at the end of this little short segment. But I'm sure we've all been in classes and we've asked our students to say something like Peter Pan with 2 aspirated P's, blow the P outwards. And here we have my niece saying Peter Pan, and we can see that she's got a nice puff of air, which is blowing the air, which is blowing the piece of paper outwards. Now, this is great, but it only goes half the way in terms of getting our students to do something different. Because now they know there's something different about P in English, but they don't know what to do in order to create it. You know, they're not going to walk out of this class suddenly aspirating all their P's. They're going to walk so there's going to be more air coming up in their system to create the aspirated P. But another part of the story is about the fact that different languages use their lips in different ways. Now, French and Japanese, and a number of other, French in particular, uses its lips in a very active way. In English, and Portuguese, it's true of Portuguese as well, in English, we tend to have very relaxed lips. Explosion comes from the same root as plosive. A P is an explosion. You have pressurized air in your mouth, and then you open your lips, or your lips open, and the sound of that explosion is that noise is what we call a P in different languages. But there's 2 ways in which the air, the pressure, the buildup of pressure in the mouth can be released. One is to make an active gesture. So if you have pressure in your mouth and you actively drop your jaw in order to make your lips part, then you'll produce an explosion of a certain type. And that's what happens in French and Japanese and in fact, most of the languages of the world. The lips are actively opened to create a P. But in English, something different happens. We have very relaxed lips, and can you just practice making 2 sorts of openings for explosions? Build up a bit of pressure in your mouth, and release the pressure by opening your lips sharply, and you'll make a sound like a French P, but. And then release the pressure just by letting the pressure blow very relaxed lips apart. And you'll feel your lips should actually move. Okay, and now try and do the same thing. These are the instructions: relaxed lips, strong abdominal push of air. So we're going to be, in the same way as you had that snorting, that action which you did the pushing there, and just try saying a few of these words using this new way of hyperarticulating an aspirated P. Have a go at that. These are the words you've got here. And again, I think you'll find that although it feels odd doing it, the actual word comes out sounding completely naturally English. This is the way that you speak English, though we're hyperarticulating now, but it's the right sound which is coming out. And this is the way that students who come from a language which isn't English can get to the correct way of producing an English aspirated P. Now, I should say that, of course, they're going to need more practice. Here we've got 2-syllable words. So we've got pot and potter. And for this, of course, there's just going to be a single pulse, because there's only 1 stressed syllable in the word potter. Only the first syllable is stressed. The whole word is going to have to be produced on the same stress pulse. So it'll be 1 push with the abdominals for this, and a single push for this word. So students have to be able to get into this idea of the right number of stresses, meaning the right number of abdominal pushes. And one other thing, so we would practice on this stuff here. One other thing which it's worth saying is that, of course, English has aspirated Ps. It also has Ps which are unaspirated. And one way, if you take a sort of a very technical approach to English, you might construct a whole set of rules about when is a P aspirated, when is it not aspirated. It's not relevant at all. The important thing is that when you make a stress pulse, the air is naturally going to create aspiration in English. And because these Ps appear either at the end of a stress pulse or at the beginning of an unstressed syllable, there won't be any rising column of air to drive the aspiration. So another good thing about taking an articulatory approach is that a lot of the rules of English pronunciation can just be thrown out of the window. These things happen naturally. They don't happen because English speakers are obeying a whole set of rules which they learnt as children or guessed as children. Okay, so this would be an approach to teaching aspirated P. One very good question is, surely aspirated P is such an unimportant part. Given that we've got the whole of English pronunciation, why are we teaching it so early on in the course? And the reason is because, in the same way as we were getting people to be present to the inside of their mouths, this allows people to be successful with one aspect of English, where they can very actively be aware of their mouths, change the setting of their lips, and therefore be successful at producing a sound which is very obvious to them differently, is very obviously different from the P in their own language. Now, they're going to have to do more of this work when they get on to producing new vowels. If they're coming from Spanish to English and they've got to somehow carve out 8 or 9 new vowels which don't exist in Spanish, clearly that's going to involve experimentation, being present to their mouths, listening to the difference. And it's good to inspire people with the idea that, yes, I can do this. I can change the way my lips work, change my speech breathing, and, my goodness, where previously I would have said papa in French, now I can say papa in English. And it so obviously sounds different. I know that I'm an English speaker when I'm doing the right things with myself. This is the advantage of doing this here. Everybody can be successful at this exercise, so it's a great exercise to do early on. Rosa said it, and I've actually said it already. Success in life isn't a straight line, and success in pronunciation isn't a straight line either. We don't have enough time in a pronunciation class for students to master English pronunciation. So what we have to do with them is give them the tools, inspire them to go and do the work outside the class. And one of the problems with listen and repeat is it relies on a model, and the model isn't there when the student is traveling home on the bus. Whereas if we give our students the actions which create English sounds, and if they then discover in the class that these actions genuinely create something that is authentic, then those actions are things that they can carry away and that they can practice for themselves when they're outside the classroom. So a big advantage of taking an articulatory approach to pronunciation is students are enabled or empowered to do the work necessary to give themselves excellent pronunciation, which isn't always the case in listen and repeat. Okay, so the fourth thing we do, and this is the last on our series of 4 things we do before we teach sounds, is we work on the English articulatory setting. Now, this is not the same as an individual articulation. What we clearly have human bodies which we can adapt to do all sorts of different physical things with. And the body has a different, we hold ourselves for doing different sports in different ways. If I'm fencing, I might hold myself like this, and then there'll be individual gestures from that starting position which will enable me to fence successfully. If I'm playing squash or doing any other sport, there's a starting position, and then there's a series of gestures of actual articulations which are the actions of that sport. And it's exactly the same in language. In languages, there are different gestures which create different sounds, but there are underlying settings for each language. And it's impossible to speak good English if you have the underlying setting for French, and vice versa. And it's best to get this being worked on right from the very start of a course, because why give people bad habits, which they're going to find difficult to unpick later on. So we work on the English articulatory setting from the very start of a course. Now, in order to work on this, this is why it's important to have done this earlier work at the start of the course, because they are going to have to be aware of where their alveolar ridge is, and the fact that the tongue has a tip, but it also has an area just a few millimeters back called the blade. And in most languages, sounds like T, D, N, and L are created because the blade of the tongue, sitting just here, comes in contact with the alveolar ridge. And that's going to change for English in a way that we're about to see. But it's important to have this vocabulary around in the class so people are aware that there's a distinction between the very tip of their tongue and the blade of their tongue, even though we're only talking about a few millimeters on the tongue surface. Okay, I'm going to play a couple of short videos here which illustrate this idea of an articulatory setting. We've got a Chinese man who's only speaking for 5 or 6 seconds on the left, and then in fact he swallows after that. But he speaks for 5 or 6 seconds, and then we've got an American woman talking over there. And what I want you to pay attention to in each case is where the body of the tongue is, and what's the relationship between the tip of the tongue and the blade of the tongue and the alveolar ridge. So there's 2 things. Roughly where is the tongue positioned, and what's happening between the tip and blade of the tongue and the alveolar ridge while they're speaking. So first of all, we'll play the Chinese. Ooh, I have to go over here. First of all, we'll play the Chinese. And now we'll play the American English speaker. This is a bit longer, but again, where's the body of the tongue gone, and what's happening between the tip of her tongue and her alveolar ridge? Oh, I can't.
When it comes to singing, I love to sing French art songs. It's probably my
when I first watched that, I wanted to watch it again. And in fact, I watched it several times. Should I play it again? Would you appreciate seeing that again? Okay, let's do that.
When it comes to singing, I love to sing French art songs. It's probably my favorite type of song to sing. I'm a big fan of Debussy. I also love operas. I love singing Donizetti and Mozart and Strauss. But when I listen to music, I tend to listen to hard rock or classic rock music. And one of my favorite bands is AC/DC. And my favorite song is probably Back in Black, which I'll listen to over and over again in my room.
It's fascinating, isn't it, to see what a difference. It's absolutely extraordinary. The tongue in English, it's displaced backwards, and then the tip of the tongue is constantly rapping against the alveolar ridge, completely different from what's happening in Chinese or French or Japanese or most other languages of the world. Now, we could ask why this isn't better known within English pronunciation teaching. This was written about very beautifully by a woman called Beatrice Honigman in 1964, and you can download this article from the web, and I'd really highly recommend it. It's a beautiful description of the English articulatory setting compared to the French one. And if I could just plug, since this is a joint meeting of NATECLA and the IATEFL Pronsig, could I just plug the Pronunciation Special Interest Group journal, which is called Speak Out, which regularly has articles about the English articulatory setting and how to teach it successfully. The point that Beatrice Honigman made was, number one, there's light contact. When speaking English, there's light contact between the sides of the back of the tongue and the rear molars. And the tip of the tongue is pulled backwards compared to other languages, and it's the tip which is constantly rapping against the alveolar ridge in order to produce sounds like T, D, N, and L. So those are the two key characteristics of the tongue in the English articulatory setting. Now, to understand how to teach this effectively, there's a couple of things we need to know about the tongue. One is it's extraordinarily complex. These are just the external muscles of the tongue. Inside the tongue, there are layers or there are fibers running in all sorts of different directions, which enable us to do absolutely extraordinary things with our tongues, like that one there. And there are even more extraordinary ones if you go onto Google Images and you look for tongue shapes. There are even more extraordinary things people have taught themselves to do with their tongues. The reason why we can do all this is because the tongue is something called a muscular hydrostat. So it's muscular because it's made up of muscle, and it's a hydrostat because basically muscle is water, and the volume of the tongue, the amount of water in the tongue, stays constant. Whatever the tongue does, its volume stays constant. So if it stretches in one direction, it must be retracting in another direction. So the whole thing stays the same volume. And other muscular hydrostats in nature include an elephant's trunk and the tentacles of a squid. And all these things are very, very flexible. Being a muscular hydrostat is a great way to produce a very flexible organ in nature. But the key thing is that it conserves its volume. You can't change the volume of the tongue. Now, I'll just stay back there. What this means is that when we talk about the tongue spreading at the back and touching the molars, it's that action which is the most primitive action in English. It's the fact that English speakers have contact between the sides of their tongue at the back with their molars. By spreading at the back, the tip automatically gets retracted because the tongue is a muscular hydrostat. So when we're teaching our students about the English articulatory setting, we shouldn't be saying, take the tip of your tongue back, because if they don't change the back of their tongue, they're going to end up with a very unnatural position. It's not going to be sustainable. What we need to do is to get students to spread the back of their tongue, and that will naturally get the tip of their tongue in the correct relationship with the alveolar ridge and for all other English sounds. So there's a number of ways that one can try and illustrate this for students. Judy Gilbert had the very nice idea of imagining that you were sitting in your throat and looking forward in your mouth. So she's looking forward from the back of her throat through her teeth, which are in the front of this diagram. And you can imagine that the sides of the tongue in English are coming up and touching the rear molars. And a woman called Pam Mashala, who's an American speech and language pathologist, calls it the butterfly position, because you've got the wings of the butterfly up at the back, and then you've got a flatter area in the middle here. However, we found that there's actually a better way. From teaching point of view, there's a better way than showing these pictures here. And what we do is we use Cuisenaire rods to produce a three-dimensional model for our students so they can examine it, feel it, see how it works inside their own mouths. And this is how the model works. What we do is we use little white rods to represent the teeth, and red rods to represent the tongue. And down here we've got, for example, a French tongue in its articulatory, the natural articulatory setting for French, with the tip of the tongue touching the lower front teeth. And up there we've got an English tongue. And what you notice about the French tongue is there's no contact here. It's been lengthened, so there's no contact with the side teeth at the bottom. With the English tongue, and you'll notice there are 8 rods here, 8 red rods here, there are 8 red rods up there. So the tongue is maintaining, it's conserving its volume. With the English tongue, it's been spread at the back, and therefore the tip of it has automatically been retracted. And then you can go one step further, having built this model, and you can pop an alveolar ridge on top using a green rod. And then it's very obvious to everybody that in a language like French or Japanese, when you want to make contact between your tongue and the alveolar ridge for T or D or N or L, it's going to be the blade of the tongue which touches the alveolar ridge, whereas the natural thing for English is for the tip of the tongue to touch the alveolar ridge. And this has a very practical effect. This has several practical effects. One is, and I've been told I'm running out of time, one is that an R sound, you can't get an R sound right in a language unless you've got the articulatory setting right. So a very nice exercise to do is to get students to do this with the English and French articulatory settings, if you're teaching French students, and similarly this. And you'll find that a French R comes out as a result of a French articulatory setting, and you can't produce an English R that way. So we won't do that now because we're running out of time. It's a very nice exercise to do because R is a real litmus test for whether you've got your articulatory setting right or not. But another part of this is that in the same way as P involved blowing the lips open, similarly aspirated T in English, and it's also going to be true of aspirated K in English, aspirated T in English involves the tip of the tongue very gently touching the alveolar ridge, and then the pressure build up behind it, blowing the tip off, and creating the aspirated T that way. In languages like French or Japanese, the blade of the tongue is actively taken off the alveolar ridge to produce a T. For English, the tip of the tongue is just blown off by the light air pressure. So perhaps if you could just say, ooh, changing color, perhaps you could just say a few of those words for yourself and consciously relax the tip of your tongue, make sure you've got a pulse of pressure coming up from your abdominal system, and say some of these words and feel what it feels like to blow the tip of your tongue off the alveolar ridge. Tea time. Okay, and I won't go through these other examples here, but similarly we need to get into 2-syllable words, and the same issue comes up with English tea, that of course it's unaspirated in situations where there isn't a pulse of energy coming up from the respiratory systems here. So again, another very nice exercise where students can be successful and know that if they come into the class saying tea for two in French, and they end up going out of the class saying tea for two, they know that they're now doing it right, that they're speaking a different language from French, and they can practice that when they go outside the classroom. They know what they have to do with themselves in order to produce an English tea. I'm going to skip over this because I've been told we're running out of time. No, I won't. I'll give you 30 seconds on this. One very important part of learning pronunciation is to have a performance piece. We're talking here about mouth gymnastics. So what students need to choose is a short piece. It might be 6 lines or 8 lines, which they don't mind saying over and over again. So the words are no longer a challenge. They know the words backwards, but they can put all their presence and attention in what they're doing with themselves when they do the mouth and the body gymnastics producing that. So that's just a quick thing about one very important part of getting good pronunciation. I mentioned that we do this before we do sounds. Once you get practice, once you become familiar with what's involved in these sorts of exercises, all the work that I've been describing can be done in an hour or less than an hour in a class. And we strongly suggest that this is the preparation for doing sounds later. This work will pay huge dividends when you actually start working on sounds and other aspects of English pronunciation. And the investment is just about an hour of their time and your time. And then the final thing to say is that another very big advantage of doing this kind of work before you do sounds is that students get a sense of English pronunciation as a system. It's no longer just 24 or a whole range of new sounds. The teacher keeps throwing in new sounds which the students have to master, and it just becomes something which is intractable and difficult. Students get a sense from this of the underlying systems behind English. The fact there's a setting for the tongue, the fact that stress is produced with the respiratory system. And once students have a sense of the setting, it then becomes exciting for them to master this new physical challenge. In the same way as people love learning new sports and enjoy doing that, when pronunciation is presented as a motor activity, a motor challenge, which students can get their mouths and the rest of their bodies around, it becomes something exciting and inspiring for them to do. And they'll go out into the playground, into the bus, wherever else it is, and be charged up with the idea that I can now say this correctly, I'm going to master this skill. Good, I think that was all I was going to say. I think we got 3 minutes for questions, because we were going to have a 5-minute extension, weren't we, Lila?
Thank you very much. We've got some questions. It's really nice to have a bit of a young learner's perspective, actually. We've got Laura Abril Ruz Perez from Mexico City. I hope I pronounced your name properly, Laura. Is this suitable to teach the diagram to children about 6, 7 years old?
Now, when she says the diagram, I'm assuming she means the diagram of the side of the mouth. And if that's,
yes.
what she does mean, the important thing is for children quite like the idea of drawing anything. So the idea of exploring the inside of their mouth and then drawing it, I would have thought would be a wonderful thing. I've never tried it with 6 or 7-year-olds, but I would certainly try it. I think they'd enjoy doing it.
Another question from Sergio Juan Gomez. What if a student wants to retain their own accent because they consider their own native accent part of their identity and they don't want to lose their identity?
I think that's an excellent question. I think it's not up to us as teachers to decide how our students are going to pronounce. What we have to do is make it possible for them to pronounce like a native speaker if they want to, but if they choose not to speak like a native speaker, that's absolutely fine too.
Question from the room, I think we had?
Yeah.
I'll bring you the mic.
I'm interested in the idea of when you said about being present. Would that help in a stressful situation or when a learner is tired in terms of articulating? Because particularly if they live in the UK, they've still got to use a second language even in that circumstance. And I know it can be harder to pronunciate in that circumstance.
The wonderful thing about our bodies is that adding a new skill doesn't take away an old skill. You know, if you learn to play football, it doesn't mean that you stop being a rugby player or stop being a cyclist. You know, there's not a problem at all about adding in another set of motor skills doesn't in any way detract from the existing motor skills we have. Right, have you got another question from...
A lot of very positive comments. Somebody mentioned you being crystal clear.
Oh, I'm delighted to hear that.
Really,
okay.
really nice.
All right.
A lot of comments, actually. Liliana Novikova. Hello, Liliana. This reminds me of singing lessons. How fun.
Yeah, okay, great. And singers, of course, singing is a performance activity. And anything where you have to perform means that the coaches, the people who teach singers, have to teach them how to perform, otherwise they're getting nowhere. So they know they have to work on the articulation, the actual physical movements underlying singing, and we should be doing the same in pronunciation, I think.
Quite a lot of people commenting on how incredibly useful this is, and I think we would all agree, wouldn't you? Okay, time for a very, very short break before we welcome Adrian.